The richest man in the city wasn't the one who changed my life. It was the only man who looked completely out of place sitting alone in my diner. I didn't know his name that rainy Tuesday night. I didn't know people lowered their voices when he entered a room or that entire neighborhoods changed because of a single decision he made before breakfast. To me, he was simply another customer who walked through the front door 10 minutes before closing while the neon open sign buzzed against the front window and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. My name is Clara Bennett. I was 26 years old, wore the same blue apron 6 nights a week, and measured success by whether my tips could cover next month's rent on my tiny apartment outside downtown Chicago. Every morning started before sunrise, every evening ended with sore feet, cold coffee, and the quiet hope that tomorrow might be a little easier than today. I had learned long ago that life didn't hand out miracles. It handed out chances, and only if you were willing to keep showing up. That little family diner on Maple Street had become my second home. The cracked leather booths, the handwritten pie menu, the old jukebox that only worked when someone hit the side twice. Nothing about the place looked impressive. But people came because someone always remembered their name, their usual order, or the story they told last week. I believed kindness was worth more than expensive furniture. Maybe that's why I never noticed the luxury sedan parked across the street until much later. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. Tall. Dark hair touched by the rain. A charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than everything hanging in my closet combined. Yet it wasn't the coat I remembered. It was the exhaustion in his eyes. The kind that sleep couldn't fix. He scanned the nearly empty diner for only a second before choosing the booth beside the window instead of the private corner most wealthy customers preferred. Strange. Powerful people usually wanted attention or privacy. He seemed to want neither. I grabbed a menu and walked over with the same smile I gave everyone else. Long day? I asked as I placed the menu in front of him. He looked up slowly, almost surprised someone had spoken to him like an ordinary person. For a heartbeat neither of us said anything. Rain tapped softly against the glass while the coffee machine hummed behind me. Then the corners of his mouth lifted into the smallest smile I had ever seen. You could say that, he answered quietly. I poured him a fresh cup without asking. Coffee tastes better when someone else thinks you need it, I said. He wrapped both hands around the warm mug but didn't drink. Instead, he looked around the diner as though he'd stumbled into a place he had forgotten existed. Peace. I had no idea that the man sitting across from me owned an empire built on influence, boardrooms, and whispered decisions. And he had no idea that the woman standing in a faded apron was about to become the only person who would ever make him question whether all that power had been worth the price. He studied the menu for so long that I started wondering if he had forgotten how diners worked. Most people glanced at the laminated pages for 30 seconds before ordering burgers or meatloaf. He quietly read every line as though each word carried unexpected importance. I finally walked back with the coffee pot in my hand and smiled. Can I recommend the chicken pot pie? Mrs. Donnelly has been making the same recipe for 32 years, and nobody has managed to convince her to change a single ingredient. He looked up from the menu. Then I would be foolish to argue with 32 years of experience. His voice was calm, almost gentle, nothing like the commanding tone I imagined wealthy executives used. Chicken pot pie it is. I wrote the order on my notepad. Would you like mashed potatoes or fresh vegetables? Whichever one you think tastes better. I laughed before I could stop myself. That is a dangerous amount of trust to place in a stranger. The faint smile returned. Maybe I am tired of making decisions. That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. Everyone wanted choices. Bigger houses. Better jobs. More opportunities. Yet the man sitting in booth 7 looked relieved that someone else had chosen his dinner. When I carried the order to the kitchen, Mrs. Donnelly peeked through the service window. Businessman, she whispered. I shrugged. Looks expensive. Acts exhausted. She nodded knowingly. Money does not cancel out loneliness. 20 minutes later I returned with the steaming plate. The buttery smell filled the booth as I placed it in front of him. "Careful," I said. "The dish is hot enough to remind you that you are alive." He actually chuckled. A real one this time. Quiet, but genuine. It transformed his face in a way expensive clothes never could. For the next several minutes I stayed busy wiping empty tables and stacking coffee mugs, yet I noticed something unusual. He was not checking his phone every few seconds. He was not answering calls. He was simply eating slowly while watching the rain race down the window beside him. The diner felt strangely peaceful, as though the storm outside had decided to leave one tiny corner of the city untouched. Eventually I brought him a slice of homemade apple pie without being asked. "You forgot to order dessert," I teased. "This one is on the house because nobody should leave here carrying only the weight they walked in with." He looked from the pie to me with quiet surprise. "You do that for everyone?" "Whenever I think they need it." He nodded thoughtfully before taking a small bite. "Then your restaurant is richer than most places I have visited." I smiled, assuming he meant the recipe. I had no idea he understood wealth better than almost anyone alive. As he reached for the check, he slipped several crisp $100 bills beneath the receipt. My eyes widened. The amount was far more than the meal cost. I picked up the cash and hurried toward the door just as he stepped into the cool night air. "Sir," I called after him. "You accidentally left too much." He turned slowly, rain catching on the shoulders of his coat. For a brief moment, he looked almost puzzled that someone would chase him down to return money instead of quietly keeping it. He glanced at the bills in my hand before looking back at me, and for the first time that evening I noticed something almost unfamiliar in his expression. Confusion. Not because I had interrupted him, but because I had returned. The rain had softened into a light drizzle that painted the street in reflections of amber street lights. I stepped closer and held out the money. "Your dinner was wonderful to serve, but this belongs to you." He did not reach for it immediately. Most people would have kept it. I shrugged. "Maybe. But then I would spend the rest of the week feeling like I borrowed something that was never mine." He studied me for another quiet moment before accepting the bills. Instead of putting them back into his wallet, he separated one $20 bill and offered it to me. "Then allow me to leave the proper tip." I smiled and accepted it. "That is generous." "Thank you." His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You know the difference." "Of course I do," I answered. "Kindness and excess are not always the same thing." The words seemed to stop him. Cars rolled past behind us, their tires whispering across the wet pavement, yet neither of us moved. Finally he slipped the remaining cash into his coat pocket. "What made you believe I had made a mistake?" I laughed softly. "Because nobody needs to spend hundreds of dollars on chicken pot pie unless they accidentally bought the whole building." A quiet laugh escaped him before he could hide it. It was warmer this time, genuine enough that even I felt surprised by how different he looked. "You have an unusual way of seeing people, Clara." Hearing my name caught me off guard. "Did I tell you my name?" He nodded toward the embroidered stitching on my blue apron. I looked down and laughed at myself. Right. I guess that mystery was not very difficult to solve. He extended his hand. "Damien." I shook it. His handshake was firm but careful, carrying none of the arrogance I had expected from someone dressed like him. "Nice to meet you, Damien." Another silence settled between us, though this one felt comfortable instead of awkward. "Do you always stay this late?" he asked. "Most nights. Somebody has to wipe the tables after everyone else goes home." "And you never wonder whether life could be easier somewhere else?" I looked back through the diner window where Mrs. Donnelly was stacking coffee cups while humming an old country song. "Every day," I admitted. "But easier is not always better. Some places pay more. Fewer places feel like home." He followed my gaze through the glass without saying anything. For just a second, the city seemed to disappear around us. No traffic. No deadlines. No expectations. Only a tired waitress and a stranger standing beneath a flickering diner sign. Then a black luxury sedan quietly pulled up to the curb. I assumed it was another customer until a neatly dressed older man stepped out holding an umbrella. He walked directly toward Damien, stopping a respectful distance away. "Sir," he said calmly. "They are waiting." Damien did not answer right away. His eyes remained on the warm glow spilling from the diner windows behind me, as though leaving that little building required more effort than arriving had. That was the moment I realized he had not come looking for dinner at all. He had come searching for something he could not buy. The black sedan disappeared into the rain, but the image stayed with me long after my shift ended. There had been something unusual about the way the older gentleman spoke to Damien. Not afraid. Not overly familiar. Simply respectful, as though he had spent years standing beside someone who carried responsibilities too heavy for one person alone. I locked the diner just after midnight, tied my apron into a neat fold, and slipped it into my canvas tote before starting the 6-block walk to my apartment. The city always sounded different after closing time. Traffic softened into distant echoes. Storefront lights reflected across the damp sidewalks. Somewhere a train horn drifted through the cool air, reminding me that thousands of strangers were still awake, each carrying stories I would never hear. The next morning arrived with the smell of burnt toast and the familiar buzz of my alarm clock at 6:30. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm. I stocked sugar packets, filled ketchup bottles, wiped fingerprints from the front windows, and greeted regular customers by name. By lunchtime I had almost convinced myself that Damien had simply been another traveler passing through. People came. People left. That was how diners worked. Around 1 o'clock the front door opened, and the tiny bell rang again. I looked up automatically. There he was. This time he wore a simple navy sweater instead of the expensive overcoat, and without the rain he somehow appeared younger. Less distant. He chose the same booth beside the window. "You came back," I said with a smile as I carried over a fresh mug before he even asked. "I was hoping the coffee was as good as I remembered," he replied. "Or maybe you were hoping for another free slice of pie." He laughed softly. "Perhaps both." I handed him the menu anyway. Rules are rules. Every customer gets the chance to pretend they are making an important decision. He glanced at the menu for barely a second before setting it aside. "Chicken pot pie again." I raised an eyebrow. "That confident?" "No," he answered. "Just certain that some things do not need improving." I walked toward the kitchen smiling to myself. Mrs. Donnelly noticed immediately. "Your businessman is back. Apparently he likes our cooking." She gave me a knowing look over her reading glasses. "Maybe he likes being treated like everyone else." Her words lingered in my thoughts while I carried his lunch to the table. Throughout the afternoon customers flowed in and out, but Damien never seemed impatient when I had to help someone else first. He waited quietly, occasionally watching children laugh over milkshakes or an elderly couple sharing pie with 2 forks. It was as if he were studying a world he had forgotten existed. When the lunch rush finally slowed, I refilled his coffee. "You spend a lot of time watching people," I said. He nodded. "People reveal who they are when they believe nobody important is paying attention." I smiled. "Around here everyone is important." He looked directly into my eyes, and for a moment the sounds of clinking dishes and quiet conversations faded into the background. "That," he said almost to himself, "is probably why this place feels different from everywhere else." After that afternoon, the visits became almost predictable without ever being scheduled. Damien never arrived at the same hour, yet somehow he always found the quiet moments between the breakfast crowd and the dinner rush, as if he respected the rhythm of the diner more than his own calendar. Some days he stayed only 20 minutes. Other days he lingered over a second cup of coffee until the afternoon sunlight stretched across the checkered floor. I stopped asking whether he wanted the menu. He stopped pretending he needed one. "Chicken pot pie?" I would ask. He would nod. And coffee? Another nod. You are becoming the easiest customer in Chicago. He smiled. I am beginning to think that is a compliment. The strange part was that we rarely talked about anything important. We discussed the weather when spring rain refused to leave. We argued about whether blueberry pie was better than apple pie. We laughed when Mrs. Donnelly insisted that every problem in life could be solved with fresh biscuits and enough butter. Somehow those ordinary conversations felt more valuable than grand speeches ever could. One Thursday afternoon, an elderly man named Walter shuffled into the diner carrying 2 grocery bags that looked far too heavy for him. Before I could leave the counter, Damien quietly stood, crossed the room, and carried the bags to Walter's usual booth. There was no performance in the gesture. No expectation of thanks. He simply returned to his seat as though helping someone was the most natural thing in the world. Walter smiled at him. Young man, your parents raised you right. Damien paused for just a fraction of a second before answering softly. I hope they would agree with you. Something about the sadness behind those words stayed with me long after Walter left. Over the next few weeks I noticed more small things. Damien always stood whenever an older customer approached the door. He thanked every server who refilled his coffee, even when it was not me. When a little boy accidentally dropped his crayons beneath the neighboring booth, Damien crouched down and gathered every single one before handing them back with a quiet smile. The child grinned as though someone had handed him treasure. None of it matched the picture I had imagined when I first saw the expensive clothes and luxury car. One afternoon curiosity finally got the better of me. What exactly do you do for work? I asked while topping off his coffee. He looked into the dark surface of the mug before answering. I spend most days solving problems that never seem to end. That sounds exhausting. It is. Then maybe you need a different job. He laughed, shaking his head. If only it were that simple. I leaned against the booth with a teasing smile. Everything complicated starts with one simple decision. He looked at me for a long moment, almost as though he was trying to decide whether to believe me. Outside, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh rain through the cracked front door while sunlight reflected across the polished coffee cups behind the counter. For the first time since I had met him, Damien seemed completely at ease. I still did not know why someone like him kept returning to a little family diner on Maple Street, but I was beginning to understand that he was not coming back for the food. He was coming back because, inside those 4 brick walls, nobody expected him to be anyone except a man enjoying a warm meal and an honest conversation. The first time Damien walked behind the counter happened because of something completely ordinary. The lunch crowd had arrived all at once, every booth was full, the coffee machine refused to cooperate, and one of our part-time servers had called in sick. I moved as quickly as I could between tables, balancing plates on one arm while apologizing for the extra weight. Mrs. Donnelly was trying to finish 3 orders at the same time, and even she looked overwhelmed. I hurried toward the coffee station with a stack of clean mugs when one slipped from my hands. It struck the floor and shattered into dozens of tiny pieces. I sighed and closed my eyes for a second. I am adding broken dishes to today's list of accomplishments, I muttered. Before I could find the broom, Damien quietly stepped out of booth 7. Please let me help. I laughed. Customers are not allowed behind the counter. Then pretend I am applying for a temporary position. Without waiting for permission, he picked up the broom leaning against the wall and carefully swept the broken pieces into a dustpan while making sure no one walked through the area. There was nothing awkward about it. No hesitation. No concern that someone might recognize him doing such a simple task. Mrs. Donnelly looked at me with raised eyebrows before smiling. Well, she whispered, he already works harder than half the teenagers we have hired. I could not help laughing. Once the floor was clean, Damien carried a fresh box of coffee mugs from the storage shelf after I pointed him in the right direction. A few regular customers watched with amused smiles. Walter lifted his coffee cup toward him. You missed a spot over there, son. Damien grinned and answered, I will try to earn a better performance review tomorrow. the entire diner laughed. It was the kind of laughter that settled into the walls and made the room feel warmer than the weather outside. For the next 15 minutes he carried empty dishes to the service window whenever customers finished eating. He held the front door open for a mother pushing a stroller. He even learned where we kept the extra napkins after asking only once. Nothing about him suggested he believed any task was beneath him. When the rush finally slowed, I leaned against the counter and handed him a tall glass of iced tea. "Congratulations," I said. "You survived your first shift." He accepted the glass with a tired smile. "I have attended meetings that were far less demanding." "Do not worry. We only throw people into the deep end on their first day." He looked around the diner with quiet satisfaction. "This is the first place I have been in a very long time where everyone works together without asking who is the most important person in the room." I folded my apron across my hands and smiled. "Because the answer is easy." He tilted his head. "Who?" I glanced toward Mrs. Donnelly as she placed a fresh pie in the display case, then toward Walter reading his newspaper, and finally toward a little girl coloring quietly while waiting for her grilled cheese sandwich. Whoever needs help the most at that moment. Damien did not answer right away. His eyes slowly moved across the diner, taking in every familiar face, every ordinary conversation, every simple act of kindness. There was something different about his expression now. It was no longer curiosity. It was longing. As though a man who had spent years building a life filled with responsibility had suddenly discovered that the smallest place on Maple Street possessed something his entire world had never been able to offer him. By the end of that week, it no longer surprised anyone when Damien walked through the front door. Mrs. Donnelly would simply point toward the fresh pot of coffee and tell me, "Your favorite customer is here again." I always corrected her. "He is everybody's favorite customer." It was true. Walter insisted on saving the newspaper crossword until Damien arrived because the two of them somehow solved it faster together. Little Emily from the neighborhood waited to show him her newest crayon drawings every Thursday after school. Even Frank, the delivery driver who rarely smiled before noon, started waving whenever the black sedan appeared at the curb. Damien had become part of our little routine without ever trying to be. Yet there was one detail that never quite fit. Every single time he arrived, the same silver-haired gentleman from that rainy night remained somewhere nearby. Sometimes he sat alone at the corner booth with nothing more than black coffee. Other times he stayed outside the diner reading a newspaper that never seemed to turn a page. He never interrupted Damien. He simply watched, patient and alert, like someone carrying a responsibility he took seriously. One afternoon I finally asked, "Is that your uncle?" Damien followed my gaze toward the older man by the window and smiled faintly. "No. His name is Thomas. We have worked together for many years. He seems very loyal." Damien nodded. "He has protected my time more often than I deserve." The answer was unusual, but I did not press further. Everyone had parts of their life they preferred to keep private. Mine included the empty apartment waiting for me every night and the dreams I had quietly postponed while helping keep the diner alive. A few days later I arrived early to help unload fresh produce from the delivery truck. As I struggled with a heavy box of potatoes, Damien appeared from nowhere and reached for the other side. "You are going to start charging me for all this free labor," I joked. "I believe I still owe the diner several hours," he replied. Together we carried the box into the kitchen while Mrs. Donnelly shook her head with an amused smile. "If he keeps this up," she whispered, "I might put him on next month's schedule." Damien laughed. "Please do not tell Clara. She might actually expect me to show up on time." The room filled with easy laughter, but when I looked toward the front windows I noticed something different. A dark SUV had slowed outside the diner before continuing down the street. It might have meant nothing. Cars passed all day long. Still, Thomas had quietly stepped outside, his relaxed expression replaced by thoughtful concentration as he watched the vehicle disappear around the corner. When he returned a minute later, Damien met his eyes. No words were exchanged. Just the smallest nod between two men who understood each other without speaking. I pretended not to notice, but a strange feeling settled in my chest. For the first time since meeting Damien, I realized there was an entire world standing just beyond the warm glow of our little diner, a world he never talked about and never allowed to cross the front door. Watching him laugh with Walter over a crossword puzzle, it became impossible to imagine that whatever waited outside could ever belong to the same man. Yet deep inside, I knew every peaceful afternoon eventually meets the moment that changes everything. The change came so quietly that I almost missed it. Damien still smiled at Walter, still complimented Mrs. Donnelly on her peach cobbler, and still asked me whether the coffee tasted better on cloudy days than sunny ones. Yet something behind his eyes had shifted. Every now and then his attention drifted toward the front window for only a second before returning to our conversation. Thomas visited the diner more often too, although he rarely stayed inside for long. He would walk the sidewalk, exchange a few polite words with neighboring shop owners, and occasionally glance toward the intersection before continuing on. None of it seemed alarming by itself, but together it felt like pieces of a puzzle I could not quite solve. One Friday evening the diner closed earlier than usual because Mrs. Donnelly wanted to attend her granddaughter's school concert. We finished wiping down the tables, turned the chairs upside down, and switched off most of the lights until only the soft glow above the counter remained. I folded my blue apron carefully and reached for my jacket. "You are walking home again?" Damien asked. I nodded. "It is only a few blocks. I actually enjoy the fresh air after standing inside all day." He looked toward the darkening street beyond the glass door. "Would you mind if I walked with you for part of the way?" I smiled. "Only if you promise not to criticize my choice of shortcuts." A faint laugh escaped him. "I think I can manage that." We stepped outside together. The evening carried the scent of spring flowers mixed with rain that had fallen earlier that afternoon. Storefront signs reflected softly across the damp sidewalk while people hurried toward restaurants, theaters, and buses. For several minutes we simply walked without speaking. Surprisingly, the silence felt comfortable. "Do you ever regret working so hard?" Damien finally asked. I thought about the question before answering. Sometimes I regret being tired. I never regret having honest work. He nodded slowly. That is an important difference. We reached the small neighborhood park where children usually played during the day. Now the swings moved gently in the evening breeze. I noticed Thomas standing across the street beside the familiar black sedan. He was not looking at us. He was watching the traffic with careful attention. Before I could ask why, a delivery van stopped near the corner. Two men stepped out carrying several large boxes marked with the name of a local charity food drive. They smiled warmly and asked if we knew where the community center was located. I pointed down the next block. "Just turn left at the church and you cannot miss it." They thanked us politely and continued on their way. I thought nothing of the brief exchange until I glanced at Damien. The warmth had disappeared from his expression. Not fear. Not anger. Simply quiet concern. Thomas crossed the street at once and spoke to him in a voice too low for me to hear. Damien listened without interrupting, then turned back to me with an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, Clara. I need to leave." "Everything all right?" I asked. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before answering. "I hope so." He stepped into the waiting sedan, and within seconds it disappeared into the evening traffic. I stood there alone beneath the streetlights, suddenly aware that the peaceful little world I had come to treasure rested beside another world I still did not understand, and for the first time I wondered whether those two worlds could remain separate forever. Damien did not come back the next day. Or the day after that. At first I told myself he was simply busy. Everyone disappeared for a while now and then. Life happened. Meetings happened. Family happened. But as an entire week slipped by, his empty booth beside the window began to feel strangely noticeable. I caught myself pouring one cup of coffee too many before remembering there was no one waiting for it. Walter asked about him on Tuesday. Mrs. Donnelly asked on Wednesday. Even little Emily walked into the diner carrying a new drawing and looked disappointed when I gently explained that our quiet friend had not visited lately. "Do you think he forgot about us?" she asked. I smiled, although I was not certain. I do not think people forget places that make them feel at home. She seemed satisfied with that answer. I was trying to convince myself as much as I was convincing her. Friday afternoon arrived with clear blue skies and warm sunshine spilling through the front windows. Business slowed after the lunch crowd, leaving me enough time to wipe down the empty booths. I had just finished cleaning booth 7 when the front door opened. My heart lifted for the briefest moment before I realized it was Thomas standing alone. He removed his hat politely and offered a gentle smile that somehow carried more exhaustion than I had ever seen on his face. "Good afternoon, Miss Bennett." "Thomas. It is good to see you. Is Damien all right?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He is well. He has simply been occupied." The pause between those 2 words said more than the sentence itself. I nodded slowly. "Please tell him everyone has been asking about him." A faint smile crossed Thomas's face. "I believe hearing that will mean more to him than you realize." Before leaving, he placed a small white envelope on the counter. He asked me to deliver this if he could not come himself. After Thomas disappeared, I looked at the envelope for nearly a minute before opening it. Inside was a handwritten note in neat, careful script. "Clara, I apologize for my absence. Some responsibilities cannot be postponed, no matter how much I wish they could. Thank you for reminding me that ordinary moments are never ordinary. I hope to earn another cup of coffee soon. Damien." Folded beneath the note was a gift card to a neighborhood bookstore. No extravagant amount. No unnecessary display of money. Just enough for a few novels and perhaps a cup of coffee at the cafe inside. I smiled despite myself. He had remembered that I once mentioned borrowing library books because I rarely spent money on myself. Mrs. Donnelly glanced at the note before looking at me with knowing eyes. "That man pays attention." I slipped the card back into the envelope and shook my head. "He listens." There was a difference, and somehow I knew Damien understood it. As evening settled over Maple Street, I stood by the front window watching families walk past beneath the golden light of sunset. Somewhere beyond the familiar neighborhood, Damien was carrying burdens he had never fully explained. Yet for the first time since he had disappeared, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer wondering who he was. I was wondering whether he had anyone else in his life who reminded him that he did not always have to carry everything alone. 3 days after Thomas delivered the envelope, the familiar bell above the front door rang just as I finished filling the sugar dispensers. I looked up without thinking, and there he was. Damien stood quietly inside the entrance, wearing a simple gray jacket instead of the tailored coats I had grown used to seeing. For a second neither of us spoke. Then I smiled. "You finally remembered where we are." His shoulders relaxed in a way I had never seen before. "I was hoping you had not replaced me with another customer." I folded my arms and pretended to think about it. There was one gentleman who ordered pie without coffee. We had to ask him to leave. He laughed, the sound carrying through the nearly empty diner. Even Mrs. Donnelly glanced over with a satisfied smile before returning to the kitchen. I poured him a fresh cup without asking. "Welcome back." He wrapped his hands around the warm mug as though he had missed more than the coffee itself. "Thank you." For several minutes we talked about ordinary things again. The bookstore where I had used the gift card. Walter finally completing the impossible crossword puzzle. Emily winning second place in her elementary school art contest. Damien listened carefully to every story, smiling more than speaking. Then he surprised me with a question. "Did you buy anything for yourself?" I blinked. "At the bookstore?" He nodded. "One novel and a cookbook I definitely did not need." Why definitely did not need? Because Mrs. Donnelly has already informed me that I still cannot bake a proper apple pie. He smiled into his coffee. Perhaps that is because she wants to keep her title. I laughed. You are learning how she thinks. The afternoon drifted by with the comfortable rhythm we had both come to expect. At one point a little boy struggled to reach the napkin dispenser on the counter. Before I could help, Damien quietly stood and handed him a stack with an encouraging smile. The child's mother thanked him before returning to her table. I noticed something then that had never occurred to me before. Damien no longer looked like someone visiting a place that did not belong to him. He looked like someone who had finally found somewhere he could simply exist without pretending to be anyone else. As the lunch crowd faded, he remained seated by the window watching sunlight spill across Maple Street. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Anything." "What changed?" He looked at me with genuine confusion. "You seem lighter." His eyes drifted toward the coffee cup. "A few weeks ago you told me that everything complicated begins with one simple decision." I remembered saying it but had never imagined he would. "I have been thinking about those words ever since," he continued quietly. "I realized I had spent years solving problems by making bigger decisions instead of better ones." I leaned against the booth, listening. "Sometimes the smallest choice changes the direction of everything," I said. He nodded slowly. "Then perhaps I finally made one." Before I could ask what he meant, Thomas entered the diner. This time he was smiling. He gave Damien a subtle nod that carried relief instead of concern. Damien returned the gesture, and for the first time since I had met them, the silent conversation between those two men no longer felt heavy. It felt hopeful. I still did not know what decision Damien had made beyond the walls of our little diner, but something told me it had nothing to do with power and everything to do with the kind of man he wanted to become. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost too peaceful to question. Damien visited whenever he could, never announcing his arrival and never asking for special treatment. He carried empty coffee cups back to the counter without being asked. He helped Walter fold his walker before the older man stood to leave. He even learned that Mrs. Donnelly became suspicious whenever someone complimented her cooking too enthusiastically. "She thinks they want the recipe," I whispered one afternoon. Damien smiled. "Does she ever share it?" "Not a chance. She says some things are earned one pie at a time." He laughed, but I noticed the smile faded sooner than usual. His attention drifted toward the window where Thomas stood outside speaking quietly with a younger man in a dark suit. Their conversation lasted only a minute before the younger man left with an expression I could not quite read. Thomas stepped inside a moment later. "May I borrow you for a minute, sir?" he asked politely. Damien nodded and followed him onto the sidewalk. Through the glass I could see them talking. Thomas appeared concerned. Damien remained calm, listening more than speaking. At one point Thomas gestured toward the city skyline in the distance before lowering his voice again. When Damien finally returned, he wore the same gentle expression, but there was a heaviness behind it that had not been there before. I refilled his coffee. "Everything all right?" He looked at the rising steam for several seconds. "Have you ever discovered that changing your life is more difficult than deciding to change it?" I leaned against the booth. "Every single day." He looked up. "Really?" "Every morning my alarm clock rings before sunrise. Every morning I have to decide all over again that I am going to keep showing up. The decision only lasts one day. Tomorrow I have to make it again." He smiled thoughtfully. "I never considered it that way. Big changes are usually made of small choices repeated over and over." He sat quietly, letting those words settle between us. A little later, Walter walked over carrying the newspaper folded beneath his arm. "Young man," he said with a grin, "you missed last week's crossword championship." Damien accepted the paper with a laugh. "Then I suppose I owe you a rematch." The two of them bent over the puzzle together while I watched from behind the counter. It struck me then that Damien no longer looked like a visitor borrowing someone else's happiness. He looked like a man building new habits one ordinary afternoon at a time. Before leaving, he paused beside the counter. Clara. Yes? Thank you for never asking me to become someone else. I smiled gently. I never thought you needed to. He nodded, almost relieved. Sometimes the hardest part of changing is believing people will still recognize you afterward. After he walked outside, I noticed Thomas holding the passenger door open. Instead of getting into the car immediately, Damien turned back toward the diner for one last look. The warm lights reflected across the front windows, and for just a heartbeat his expression softened into something that looked remarkably like home. Watching him drive away, I realized that whatever life he had been leaving behind had not disappeared overnight. It was simply losing its hold one quiet afternoon, one honest conversation, and one cup of coffee at a time. Autumn arrived almost without warning. The maple trees outside the diner exchanged their summer green for deep shades of gold and crimson, and the first cool breeze carried the familiar scent of cinnamon from Mrs. Donnelly's kitchen. One quiet afternoon, I found Damien standing outside before opening hours, looking through the front window instead of coming inside. When I unlocked the door, he smiled with the same quiet warmth I had come to recognize. "You are early," I said. "I was not sure whether I came to eat lunch or simply to see this place again," he admitted. "Then you should probably do both." He laughed softly and followed me inside. The diner was still empty, the chairs resting upside down on the tables while sunlight stretched across the polished floor. Together we turned every chair upright before the first customer arrived. It felt so natural that neither of us mentioned it. As I reached for my blue apron hanging on its hook behind the counter, Damien watched for a moment before speaking. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why do you always fold it so carefully at the end of every shift?" I looked down at the faded fabric in my hands. The edges were worn from years of washing, and one pocket had been stitched twice after beginning to tear. "Because this apron reminds me who I am," I answered honestly. "It reminds me that every honest day matters, even when nobody notices it." He remained silent, waiting for me to continue. "People think dignity comes from titles, money, or recognition. I think it comes from doing ordinary things with care." His eyes never left the apron. "No matter how small they seem?" "Especially then." He nodded slowly, as though another piece of a puzzle had quietly fallen into place. The lunch rush arrived soon afterward, filling every booth with familiar faces. Damien moved naturally through the room again, carrying fresh coffee to Walter after I became busy with another table, holding the front door for parents balancing strollers, and entertaining little Emily by guessing the animals she was drawing before she finished coloring them. No one treated him like an outsider anymore. He belonged without ever asking to belong. Late that afternoon, when the last customer finally left, Damien remained seated by the window. Thomas arrived a few minutes later but did not interrupt immediately. Instead, he stood beside the booth with a gentle smile. "Whenever you are ready, sir." Damien looked around the quiet diner one last time before standing. Then he surprised me. He walked behind the counter, reached toward the hook where my apron hung, and carefully lifted it with both hands. For a second I wondered if he had mistaken it for his coat. Instead, he brushed a tiny speck of flour from the front pocket before handing it back to me with extraordinary care, as though it were something priceless. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me that there are things in this world more valuable than influence." I accepted the apron without speaking because I suddenly understood what he truly meant. He was not thanking me for serving coffee or sharing conversations. He was thanking me for reminding him that a person's greatest legacy is not built by how many people know their name, but by how many people feel safe, respected, and valued when they are standing beside them. As Damien walked toward the waiting sedan with Thomas, I folded the apron against my heart for just a moment before hanging it back on its hook, somehow knowing that neither of us would ever see that simple piece of fabric the same way again. 5 years have passed since the night a tired stranger walked into our little diner looking for nothing more than a quiet meal. Maple Street still wakes to the smell of fresh coffee before sunrise, Walter still insists on finishing the crossword before lunch, and Mrs. Donnelly still refuses to reveal the secret ingredient in her apple pie. Some things never change. The best things rarely do. Other things changed so gently that none of us noticed until we looked back. Mrs. Donnelly finally decided she deserved to retire after nearly 4 decades behind the stove. The entire neighborhood gathered on her last afternoon, filling every booth with laughter, flowers, handwritten cards, and stories she claimed she had already forgotten. Before locking the front door that evening, she placed a small envelope in my hand. Inside were the ownership papers to the diner. I stared at her in complete disbelief. "I cannot afford this," I whispered. She smiled and shook her head. "You already paid for it. One honest day at a time." Tears blurred my vision before I could answer. The following morning I unlocked the same front door with the same old brass key, but everything felt different. Not because the building belonged to me. Because I finally understood what it meant to carry someone else's legacy with gratitude instead of fear. Damien arrived before the first customer, just as he had done so many times before. He carried no expensive gifts, no grand announcements, only a small wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the very first diner receipt from the rainy night we met. Across the back he had written a single sentence in careful handwriting. "The greatest wealth I ever discovered was waiting at booth 7 with a fresh cup of coffee." I looked up, unable to speak. He smiled with the same quiet warmth that had replaced the exhaustion in his eyes years ago. "I thought it belonged here." I reached behind the counter and picked up my old blue apron. The fabric had faded even more with time, and the pocket Mrs. Donnelly stitched years earlier was beginning to fray again. I held it out toward Damien. "Would you help me open today?" He accepted the apron with both hands, smiling as though I had entrusted him with something priceless. Without a word, he tied it around his waist, straightened the front pocket, and walked beside me as we prepared the coffee, arranged the menus, and unlocked the front door together. No photographers waited outside. No speeches were given. No one cared about titles or accomplishments. The first customer simply smiled and said, "Good morning." Damien smiled back just as naturally. "Good morning. Welcome in." Watching him greet strangers with the same kindness he had once searched for himself, I finally understood that real change never arrives all at once. It is built through ordinary mornings, honest conversations, shared meals, and the quiet decision to become a little better than yesterday. People often ask me whether I ever learned everything about Damien's past. The truth is, I stopped needing to know. The man who first entered our diner carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. The man standing beside me now carried a pot of fresh coffee and asked whether anyone wanted a refill. In the end, the most remarkable transformation was never about leaving one life behind. It was about discovering that the strongest person in the room is often the one who makes everyone else feel welcome. And every time I fold my blue apron at the end of another ordinary day, I smile because I remember something that changed both of our lives forever. Power may open doors, but kindness is the reason people invite you to stay.